Hey guys! So we're going to start in just 1 minute and we're going to be joined by Bruce Bratley, the CEO at First Mile, which is an amazing recycling company, green recycling company. And we're going to talk to you about how Lara Intimates works with them. And you guys will also get to ask any questions that you have about waste and green recycling and all things sustainability. So we're just waiting for First Mile and then we'll get started. Bruce, how are you?
Great. Hi, I'm really good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm excited. I think this is our first ever live.
Excellent. It's great. It's good fun. There's a lot of IGTV going on at the moment. It's superb.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just starting to tell everybody that's watching, but basically just to give everybody some context, I'm Cindy, the CEO at Lara Intimates, and this is Bruce Bratley, the CEO at First Mile. And First Mile is an amazing recycling company, and I'll let you explain more. But Lara actually has our textile waste from our factory in Hackney recycled with First Mile, which is amazing because it allows us to be one of the only factories that has no textile waste going to landfill. So to get us started, could you give us some like an introduction to what you do at First Mile and how it started and what your mission is?
Yeah, certainly. Well, hi everybody, and great to be here live with Lara Intimates. So I suppose it all started for me when I was 13, and I was brought up on a farm in Yorkshire. My first business was growing and selling cauliflowers on the side of the road, and then I fell in love with the environment and the environmental movement. And sort of fast forward 20 years, I started First Mile because I had a bit of experience of the waste and recycling industry, and I realized that actually we've given the role of recycling to an industry, and they're not necessarily the best guardians for recycling, because many of them come out of the landfill sector and the quarrying and mining sector. So I set up First Mile 16 years ago as a recycling-led, purpose-led business. And I realized very quickly when I was setting it up that many of London's businesses, we now operate in London and Birmingham, had a waste service, often going to landfill. They had no recycling service. So I set First Mile up. Actually, one of our first businesses was Margaret Howell, a retailer of clothes and TM Lewin shirt maker. And sort of our history has been steeped in fashion retail and fashion manufacturing ever since. And we provide a daily recycling service for businesses in London and Birmingham and some nationwide now. And we lead with recycling rather than it being something as an add-on. I'm absolutely passionate about trying to get businesses to recycle as much as possible. And it's really difficult, and you have to work really hard at it because there's so many factors going on and so many things happening. But we're passionate about it, and it's the lifeblood of the business. And I'm lucky enough to work with lots and lots of individuals and lots of brilliant customers who are as passionate as we are about recycling. So we're all about recycling, and great to be here.
That's so cool. Hopefully our audience will really enjoy this, because I know every time we post about anything to do with sustainability or like green information, our audience gets really excited about it. It's interesting to hear that your story with environmentalism started with food, and now you also have a textile recycling arm to your business. Could you talk a little bit about like how did you learn about a textile recycling problem in the world, and what brought you to start that arm of your business?
Well, like many of our sort of divisions of what we're doing are usually customer led, and we sort of start to hear quite early on about this pain point that customers have, and we've done it with confidential services, toner cartridges, waste electronics. And then probably about 5 or 6 years ago, customers were saying to us, we have a surplus of textile, or we have offcuts if we're a tailoring company, or whole garments, and many offices sort of have a bring back scheme for staff to bring back whole garments. And we were we thought there was a whole textile recycling industry out there, and we maybe introduced you to it, but actually it turns out that once again we sort of see an industry that we thought was actually quite well developed, and it turned out it isn't at all well developed. There are so many issues around it. So we got into textile recycling to help solve customer problems. And then once you start to sort of focus in on an area, you realize, wow, there is a whole world of things going on. And I'm particularly interested in textile recycling and the textile industry because I'm a social scientist. So when I went to university, I studied social geography. I did a sort of PhD in environmental Marxism, my claim to fame, which also got me to the environmental stuff. And so the social element is really important. And with the textile industry, you have an environmental problem, which is the textile industry can be very polluting, and we've exported a lot of the externalities of the environment to developing countries. You also have a social issue with the manufacture, and then you also have a waste issue at the end of life. And so all those things come together. I find them incredibly interesting. And so we're trying to deal with the textile recycling at the end of the life, if you like, which is possible but not easy. And it's not easy, and sometimes not possible at all, because of what's happening further up the supply chain. Putting loads and loads of different materials and different components and different elements into items of clothing in the same way that we do with items of packaging and electronic products, and they all reach their end of life, sadly usually quicker than they really should. And then it's the recycling industry to somehow disaggregate all of those into their single components and recycle them, and that makes recycling incredibly difficult when you've got a garment that's made out of several components and several different materials. So it's a really interesting challenge, and it sort of is much wider than actually just saying, what are we going to do with it when it ends up in the recycling bin?
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. There's I find the fashion and textile supply chain really fascinating, and it's so vast. And like you said, the issues are both environmental and social, and to be able to solve it, you need to have solutions that are on such a large scale. But I think, it's amazing that there is kind of a turnkey service that we found with you guys, because I know before I found First Mile for textile recycling, I was calling every single shredder and recycler I could find online in the UK, and they were all saying, we only recycle carpets, or you can only send us cotton and then we'll cut it up into rags for like people that are cleaning buildings to use. Like, it's crazy that there's no solution to this. So I think it's an amazing service that you have. Yeah,
absolutely. And the thing that you're doing with a dead stock is really important, because you could call it recycling, it might not be recycling, but the fashion industry just seems to leak so many valuable materials that have cost a huge amount in human capital and environmental capital to manufacture, and then it all sort of leaks out, and it doesn't seem to have a purpose. So I think there's so many different facets to textile recycling that are so important, and the sort of the things that we've relied on historically, such as taking things to charity shops and having them reused, those markets are now starting to dry out and slow down, because a lot of that material that you take to charity shop actually ends up in African markets. And by exporting all of we export the externalities of our consumer lifestyle. We've exported lots and lots of chinos and John Lewis shirts to Africa. We've destroyed a traditional African textile industry, because handmade garments are very expensive compared to some imported cheap garments. And Africa's now full of clothes, and they don't want any more clothes from us as a reuse market. So it's sort of like, where are we going to turn to next? And it's a massive growing problem as we continue to sort of put more and more into the system through this sort of constant consumerism of clothes, and there isn't any real good outflow of them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I could literally talk about this for about 2 hours. So to go more specifically into what you guys are doing and your supply chain at First Mile, so when I have somebody come and pick up a bag full of textile recycling from our factory, where does it go and what's the process?
So what we're doing, with the textiles is that they get graded in terms of a process. So not the case in, I'll tell you the whole thing rather than specific to you, because you've got quite specific items that are offcuts from the process. So if it's a whole garment, that will go through a facility where it's graded in terms of whether it has a resale value. And if it's a very high quality whole garment, it could go into the European resale market, but that's quite a small element of it. As I've said, there's also the developing world, mainly East Africa, where whole garments go to as well. And it's obviously better if we can resale a whole garment than trying to recycle it and cut it up for recycling. If it can't be recycled as a whole garment, that material then goes into a sorting facility where we're trying to identify garments with, or fabrics that have got a high element of cotton and wool in them, and we want lower quantities of polyester in those. If something's a pure polyester item, it can be recycled in a separate facility, but increasingly polyesters or plastics in clothing is an additive, such as latex and elasticated materials. But if it's purely something like a fleece, then it can go to a separate stream. So what we're then doing is trying to get a higher quality and as close to a single material as possible. And then that material will then go into a number of different functions. If it's a low-grade material, it can go into a carpet underlay. If it's a high-grade material, it can go into a wall insulation or a felt type product. So very much depends on which material it's going into. And this is why the supply chain is really important, because actually we can get material that, if we get a pure cotton material, that can be pulled out of the weave and then respun into cotton fibers, or the same with wool. But it's very rare now to find a material that is 100% wool or 100% cotton. It nearly always has something else in it, which is why we need to start to work more up the supply chain to get more pure materials. And there's also, as I said, if you have something that's 100% polyester, such as a fleece, they in the first instance are made out of recycled bottles, and they can be recycled back into a plastic flake, which can go on to be used other items. But often we're mixing polyester with another material, and that makes the plastics recycling element of it very hard as well.
Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot about this, not being able to recycle mixed materials. And one thing that I've been wondering about is I think in pretty much all apparel factories, they're using polyester thread because it's stronger than cotton thread, and cotton has a tendency to snap. So if you had an entire cotton garment, but then it was made with polyester thread, would that prevent it from ever being recycled?
It depends, I think, on the percentage, but also because it's so strong. I mean, there's a level of irony here, because we're making garments that are very strong, and then we're treating them as disposable items, and then they're thrown away, and then there's an expectation they're going to get recycled. But because they've been used, if you've got a cotton garment with polyester thread, that is harder to break down, because you're trying to disaggregate the cotton to break it into fibers to respin it into a fiber. But if it's got polyester in there as well, that's very strong holding it together, it could be harder to break that down and pull it apart again. So there's an element of it depending on the percentage in there, but also there's this element of it's used in a place where the seams are very, very strong, which makes it harder to disaggregate and break down for recycling the garment.
Yeah. Okay, so if so those examples that you gave about like carpet filling, or like insulation in walls, if, like, obviously I would imagine that the majority of those things are not made from recycled items. So if they're not made from textile waste or some other kind of recycling, where are they coming from?
So if it is a sort of a rubberized carpet underlay, it's made out of virgin oil. So using a recycled blended fabric for that type of product is very good, because you're immediately offsetting oil consumption for making that type of product. If it's sort of the traditional thicker felt layer. It's made out of a mixture of a coconut byproduct, a husk, or another byproduct from an agricultural product, and also some byproducts from the cotton manufacturing process. So it is a byproduct, but it'll be a byproduct of a farm product, rather than, if we can get recycled materials, recycled fabrics into carpet underlay, into wall insulation, it has similar properties, and it's a super use of the material, as long as we have this mixed fibre garments entering the waste streams. There's a huge amount of attention going on to recycling technologies, because the amount of waste clothing that we have as a nation and a world is absolutely, I mean, every person in the UK produces 3 kilograms, and that's not households, that's every individual. Each one of the 60 million of us produce 3 kilograms of clothing waste that we throw away every single year, and that's the equivalent of a t-shirt or a shirt every 2 weeks just been thrown away. And at the moment, only 10% of that gets recycled, and just under 10% gets reused. So there's 80% that is either going into landfills or into incinerations, and that's a really valuable resource that we need to capture and use. And we need to develop the technologies to make it into more products, because we can't just make in carpet underlay and wall insulation, and we need to find a way of innovating to break down these materials in the garments through either chemical recycling or mechanical recycling, to turn them into new yarns and threads. And the plastic recycling is a very good example. There's some technology that's not yet commercially available yet, but it's at the sort of pre-commercial stage for chemical recycling of polymers, where you can put a plastic rich garment. It doesn't need to be 100% plastic rich garment, so maybe a fleece with 10, 15, 20% other materials in it, and you can put it into a chemical processing facility, and it will bring out from the other side of that naphthas, which is the precursor to making new plastic. So that's a fantastic way that technology's evolved to recycle material that's plastic rich. And what we're trying to do as an industry is find different ways of recycling materials, but because of the mixed element of them, it's a challenging industry.
Yeah, and it's amazing, because you're describing all these complex things, and I'm like, that's amazing, but also, shouldn't you just wear that t-shirt or that bra a few weeks, throw it away, and then, you know, for the things that we do have to get rid of, we can use these processes, but shouldn't there just be, like you said earlier, like better treatment of the things that you own and actually caring about them? I'm sorry, go ahead.
But just think about where they're coming from as well, and you know, the social cost and the environmental cost of manufacturing them, and where they've come from. And I mean, I was reading that we've got 16 billion apparently, and I think this might just be women, I don't know, but 16 billion pounds worth of clothes in our wardrobes that are unworn and never worn. And we're just very good at buying things and never putting them putting them on, which is, you know, quite staggering really. And on average, half your wardrobe is never worn, which is quite a great situation.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm just shocked. I saw a while ago, one of the new online high street retailers was selling those meal deals, where like on a Thursday you can buy new shoes, a new dress, new jewelry, new handbag for like $29.95, and then obviously the idea is that you just throw it away and buy something new the next weekend. And it's kind of amazing how our perspective is, I think, quite needs to be towards something that's more sustainable long term. So one thing, I don't know exactly how you guys think about this at First Mile, but if every company in fashion was to recycle their textiles, like what kind of impact would that have on the sustainability of the industry or the world? Like, do you guys think about, I don't know, goals in terms of how much this can be scaled and how much of a positive impact it would
have? I think in terms of sort of the metrics, it's huge, there's some debate about the impact of the textile industry, but it's said it's second only to agriculture in terms of its global impact. If you look at all the elements of the fashion and textile industries across the globe, So the impact would be absolutely significant. But I think from a UK sort of centric perspective, I think that the coronavirus and prior to that, leaving Europe, there was a lot of discussion around how long our supply chains have got with globalization. And it's almost a case that you buy something, you don't really know where it's come from, how many people are involved, what country the components were coming from. So I think people are starting to get more and more interested, and particularly with the greater interest in sort of the environmental movement in recent years, people are starting to get really interested in the level of interest is quite peaked by where things come from. And we, I think, as a nation, need to think about that. We need to think about how resilient our supply chains are in terms of food, in terms of from the recycling industry, feedstock into manufacturing.
Even PPE, like in the current situation that we're in, we're not set up to make that much of it in this country, and maybe we could have gotten some faster had we had the supply chain completely in the UK set up.
Yeah, and we just sort of had this really super long globalized supply chain, which has worked well for the last 20 years, but suddenly there's a relative, in this instance, it's a global pandemic, but it's a relatively small, initially when it was in Wuhan, there's a relatively small number of countries affected, but it shakes the whole supply chain in the whole of the UK. And we're working on a number of initiatives with First Mile. We're delivering fruit and veg directly to households, which is around farm security and those supply chains being disrupted. We're working on supplying surplus plants from garden centres, because the growers still have the plants, but the garden centres have closed down. Again, supply chain issue. And then even a really quirky one, the sort of pumps and triggers on hand sanitizer and cleaning products. There's a shortage of those in the world, because it turns out that lots of those pumps and triggers and caps were made in northern Italy or in China. Both of those areas were hit very early on with coronavirus. And so that global supply chain, I think people start to think about. And then if we can start to localize things a little bit more, then we should start to look at that triple bottom line, as you do at Lara Intimates, in terms of what the social impact is, the environmental impact, and we can start to move things forward. And I think the public are genuinely starting to get interested in it. It's still early days, but I think they're starting to get interested in it. And an element of that is what happens to it when it gets to the end of life as well, because we have this sort of culture where the recycling industry is sort of, I think people assume that we've got some sort of magic wand that makes things disappear or turn into wonderful new products, but it's quite challenging, and we need to sort of coordinate with the entire supply chain.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I remember when I was setting up Lara that there were so many people that said, oh, why don't you just make it in another country? It'll be a lot cheaper. It'll be easier getting started. And I was kind of like, I don't know what the future holds, but my guess is that the supply chains are going to continue to chase cheaper and cheaper labor around the world for another decade or two. And then suddenly those costs aren't going to be necessarily outweighing the speed and the time that you lose. And they're going to end up coming back to England anyway. So I'd rather focus on my supply chain here and make that strong, so that, we're in a good position in several years. And as more and more people care about where their things are coming from.
Absolutely, and I think when you look at all of the factors rather than just the cost of things, then you have a great story to tell your customers, you're employing local people. If you look at everything, I don't think things cost that much more made in the UK or made a bit closer to the market.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So if it's okay, I have a few questions that our audience asked in advance, so I'll just ask you those, and then we can wrap up final thoughts. So the first question is, I'm really interested in the opportunity to turn waste into green energy. Is that possible? And if so, can you talk about how it works?
Yeah, sure. So there's two main ways that happens. The first one is food recycling, and we sort of start full circle. We started talking about food and we're back again. So food waste is full of energy. It's why we eat it. And a key thing that it's used for is it's put into an anaerobic digestion facility, which is just like a massive industrial stomach full of bacteria. And the bacteria digest the food and they make two things. One is methane, and the other one is they break down the solids in the food and they make a fantastic fertilizer for garden centers and farms that's super nutritious. The methane is then fed into the gas network. So when you switch your gas hob on at home, a percentage of that is made out of the food waste that people are recycling at home. And that's a really super simple way of doing it. We keep the fertilizer, but we're also generating a renewable source of energy from the food that is manufactured. The other way of doing it is we incinerate waste. We've done this for many, many years. And that waste is incinerated to generate heat and electricity. The electricity obviously goes into the grid, and the heat can be used locally to heat greenhouses, or it can be fed into a district network. The element of which that is renewable, the whole waste incinerators, as long as they generate electricity, are classified in Europe and the UK as being a renewable source of energy. How you classify that as renewable is questionable, because if you're burning plastics which could otherwise be recycled, or paper that could otherwise be recycled, I'm not sure that's necessarily a renewable source. So while generating electricity from waste is really important for a final outcome, if nothing else can be done with it, we have to be careful that we're not using waste incineration as a simple get-out clause, and it becomes easier than recycling, therefore it becomes the default option. So we need to treat recycling as the final disposal option, incineration as the final disposal option, and make sure that we've put a huge amount of effort on reuse, repairing, recycling before we send something for incineration, and then it becomes renewable energy.
Well, that's really interesting. So, okay, so as a rule of thumb, we should be recycling as much of our food waste and putting it into the compost bin as possible, and then putting as little possible into our bins.
Absolutely. There's just one small caveat, which is eat as much food waste as you can, or eat as much food as you can, and then it's a bigger waste. That's the best.
Okay. Somebody asked also, how many times can fabric be recycled?
Wow. It's quite difficult to recycle it because the threads become shorter as you recycle it. If it's plastic, it can be recycled a number of times. If it's chemical recycling, it can be recycled infinitely, because you're taking it back to the sort of the core components of the polymers. But actually, a lot of the recycling that we have at the moment is a relatively limited number of times, because you're taking something which might be a full garment, such as a raincoat or a pair of jeans or a t-shirt, and that's been made into carpet underlay, and then at the end of its life, the carpet underlay won't be recycled, however, to be incinerated. However, what we're doing is we're taking a throwaway item or a consumable item, such as some t-shirts or jeans. They can't be reused for anything else, so they're turning to carpet underlay, which then has a long lifetime. So it's residing in the economy for a long time. We're not sort of spinning it out as another consumer product. So I think you need to measure, as well as the number of times something can be recycled, you also need to measure how long it's going to remain a product. So for example, if you're recycling a Coca-Cola bottle and it gets recycled back into a Coca-Cola bottle and then back into a Coca-Cola bottle, it might be recycled 4 times, but if its lifespan is only 20 minutes on each time in the economy, it's not going to be as good as something which might only be recycled once, and then it resides in the built environment for a longer time.
So your work must be a lot around balancing. I want to recycle things in a way that they can be used for a long time, but then if they're going to be recycled many times, I don't want to do it in a way that uses loads of energy. So you're kind of balancing time versus energy usage in how you recycle things.
Yeah, absolutely. And different materials have different qualities. So for example, there's this concept of a permanent material and a non-permanent material. And a permanent material is where the recycling happens at the molecular level. So permanent materials the main ones are steel, aluminium and glass. And every time you recycle those, they go back into pristine materials again. And so they can be recycled over and over and over again, and there's no degradation in their quality. But plastics, wool, cotton, paper fibers, as you recycle those, the quality degrades.
Well, I can't remember. We were talking about how many times things can be recycled and balancing like how long they remain in use versus how much energy it takes to recycle different things.
So what I was saying is a really good way of thinking about it is, so there's the concept of permanent materials and temporary materials. And a permanent material is something like aluminium, steel, glass, where the recycling happens at the molecular level. And once these materials are recycled, they're in pristine condition again. And then non-permanent materials such as plastics, wools, cottons, paper fibers, they degrade each time they're recycled. So a really good way of thinking about it is paper. So you might end up with a very nice white birthday card or piece of paper, and then it's recycled into a cardboard box. It might be recycled a few times into a cardboard box as the fiber length shortens, and then we end up with an egg box where the fiber's very short and it's sort of more of a pulp type activity. So as the recycling process goes on, the fibers tend to change with non-permanent materials. So it will, how many times it can be recycled very much depend on the type of material and also the process it goes through and how difficult that is on the fibers.
Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting. The only other question that we had was about whether things had to be a pure type of material, like 100% cotton, in order to be recycled. So if whoever asked that question is watching, I would just refer you to our conversation a few minutes ago. So I think just to wrap up, like, are there any final thoughts about textile recycling or with our audience that you'd like to share?
I think the key thing is that we are only taking a small amount of our textiles and clothing to recycling banks or finding ways of recycling, and we're still dumping lots and lots of material into black bags at home and throwing them away. And while on this Instagram Live, it might seem that the recycling industry doesn't have all the questions, and we're very honest about it. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. But the industry is moving very, very quickly. So the key thing I want you to do is to keep with us, keep sending materials for recycling, and we will get there. Don't give up. And at the moment, too many things are going to landfill. Too many things have been incinerated, and we need to get more people to do more recycling, and we will find solutions. So keep it going.
Okay, so watch this space. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Been really, really fun chatting to you. So yeah, hopefully we can do this again at some point. And thank you again so much for all the work that you guys do, because I'm so happy to be a factory that's not producing any textile waste. And I'm really happy to know that after our offcuts are leaving our factory, they're going somewhere else and living as carpet underlay or insulation or somewhere where hopefully they're used for a long time.
Absolutely, and thank you for all the great work you're doing, because that's the key thing. Because otherwise, the dead stock would end up in the waste stream as well. So it's an absolutely brilliant thing you're doing at Lara Intimates. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. All right, I'm gonna hang up now, but it was great speaking to you, and hopefully talk to you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.